Amos within the book of the 12. A first quick look at that. Just looking at some of those verses, they're called theme verses in scholarship because they come at the themes of those individual writings. So Amos, obviously, I've just quoted Amos 1:2. The Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. And actually, if you go to the previous page, chapter 3, verse 16, or at least in most English Bibles, Hebrew first numbering is different, and a few English Bibles and German Bibles and so on have this different. But I think in your Bible it will be 3:16. Joel 3:16, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. Sounds familiar? And the heavens and the earth shake. Here you've got the earthquake. So that's quite an interesting link. One of the last few verses in Joel, and the first thing that Amos says is a very close link between the two. And it is the big question is, how did those links originate? In a lot of scholarship, there is speculation about, you have those different prophetic books, and then they were brought together in the book of the 12, and someone, inspired by God, would bring them together and link them by adding a few verses that make those links obvious. Could be, and some argue from the superscriptions of some of the books, we've observed that some are very similar. The word of the Lord came to Micah, the word of the Lord came to Amos, the word of the Lord came to Zephaniah, and I thought, well, these are all the same. Maybe someone put those books together, and there was an earlier collection of just those books. So I think there might be something to that. I don't want to dismiss it, but I'm not one of those who's fully convinced by that. Because it's not done terribly consistently. I would sort of expect there to be an editor. If an editor brings together all 12 books, why not have the same superscription for each 12? Maybe it's just my mind. That doesn't work like an ancient Hebrew editor's mind inspired by God. And would things to be much neater linked together. And you've got some of those interesting links, but they're not always there, so why is that? So it may be there are different reasons for different links. In this case, as I said, Joel does have lots of allusions to other parts of the 12 and indeed to other parts of the Bible. It may be that Joel or whoever put this together deliberately picked this to link with Amos, knowing that this book was composed to fit in there. Maybe not. We go to the end of Amos, 9:12, and I've already quoted that as well, that the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name, here we've got God's name again, very significant position, may possess. So David may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations. Why? Why single out Edom? When it's all the nations anyway, why not just say, and all the remnant for the nations? Or it could be any other nation. But why mention Edom here? Well, it could be because Edom does stand in other places as a symbol for other nations. Edom has a particular symbolic significance for two reasons. One is it's very closely related to Israel. Remember the Genesis story, how Edom originated, Esau, Isaac and Esau, brothers. So it's a close family relationship. And the other thing is Edom is similar to Adam. And Adam, as you know, means humanity. So even on a level of word link allusion, you can say how Edom can stand for the rest of humanity. But maybe it's no coincidence that the next book here in our canon is Obadiah, which is all about Edom. It's basically just got two oracles, and they're both, thus says the Lord concerning Edom. They're both about Edom. There's nothing else in there. Day of the Lord about Edom. So that's interesting. could be a significant keyword that connects Amos and Obadiah. What would be the impact of that? Forgotten who said this, but I've quoted someone as saying that, well, if Amos starts, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, the pastures of the shepherds wither, and the top of Carmel dries up. Carmel, is in the north, very fruitful, foresty type region. Lovely place. Dries up, sounds horrid, sounds disastrous. But if we realize it's an allusion back to the Lord roars from Zion, and we remember that Joel doesn't end with this, it doesn't end with the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, but he ends on something much more positive. In that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, the hills shall flow with milk, and it's all well in the end. Maybe that helps then to soften Amos a bit. Well, we don't have much time to discuss it, so I'll skip that. Just to say, you make up your own mind what you think. It doesn't really persuade me. To me, that sounds still pretty disastrous. And even if I've just read Joel, and I know, well, in Joel there's some good stuff coming as well, that doesn't, for me, it doesn't soften the blow in Amos. It doesn't really work for me. And I've listed a few other references that scholars have observed that are quite interesting. So we've got this whole list of nations there, and interestingly, Joel makes reference to Tyre and Sidon, the two Phoenician cities up north, and Amos refers to Tyre. Joel refers to Philistia. Amos refers to one of the Philistine cities, Gaza, as well as both referring to Edom, and Joel refers then to the Greeks and Egypt as well, which Amos doesn't. So as we start to observe those links between different prophetic books, it's useful to remember that they do not always come in the same order. So saying those Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament, the order is largely Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah. And so suddenly those links between Joel and Amos, what happens to them? Because they are no longer next to each other. And there's a bit of a debate as to which order is original. Did someone just mess up the beautiful work of someone else by getting the order wrong? Or some people argue there are different strategies being pursued. There's a slightly different message, slightly different emphasis in those two collections, depending on how they are ordered. So there's a lot of debate there, which I'm, as I said before, I'm slightly on the more cautious side. I do think there's a message emerging from the Book of the 12 that goes beyond the 12 different messages, so to speak. But I'm more skeptical than maybe the majority of scholars who've done a lot of work on the Book of the 12 in the last 2.5 decades, about there being a very strongly redacted, edited Book of the 12. I think of it still more of an anthology of writings, where, yeah, someone did think, I imagine, carefully in which order those come. And yeah, I do not rule out a possibility that some links were made by an editor, but I don't see as much activity there as other people do. And thankfully for the second part of the book, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and so on, the order is the same there. Although if you wanted to complicate matters, we could look at the different order in which those prophets are mentioned elsewhere as well, in the ascension of Isaiah and so on. But I'll leave it there. There's a debate about Qumran manuscript as well, but that's gone to a dead end as well. I think basically we've got two different orders. The one that's mostly in Greek and the one that's mostly in the Hebrew. And actually where the Book of the 12 comes in the Bible is also different from manuscript to manuscript within the Hebrew manuscripts. We are most familiar, of course, with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the book of the 12. Ezekiel, Daniel, we have usually in English Bibles. In Hebrew Bibles, Daniel wouldn't be there. Goes to a different part of the canon. But that order of the major and the minor prophets is different in different Masoretic manuscripts. And some rabbis reflect on the reasons for that and so on. So one must be careful in making arguments about a canonical arrangement to be aware of which canonical arrangement are we talking about. Just briefly, on the motives from the book of Amos elsewhere in the Bible, where it doesn't matter so much where exactly in the Bible it comes. Just some of the key themes, which we won't pursue now. Care for the poor. I think it is true to say that there is more of an emphasis on that in Amos than in Hosea, in other parts. It is one of the key things, and is quite significant in Proverbs as well, in James, and then, as you know, in Luke Acts. Of all the Gospels, Luke is particularly keen always to include the marginalized and speak about the poor and so on. The futility of merely external religion, well, very famously in the Sermon on the Mount, we have Jesus expounding on that theme. The danger of complacency. We read in 1 Peter, judgment begins with the house of God. So thinking we are the elect should never mean, well, judgment is for other people. That means God is particularly interested in how we behave. And then the nature of judgment and hope. That's, of course, long-term of huge significance, that God judges sin, and that is a righteous judgment. That there is hope through judgment. There's not a great deal in Amos, and some have worried about that. There's a very famous saying by Wellhausen, of the early German scholars of historical critical method. He talks about the end of Amos as like roses and lavender, following on from bloodshed and iron and stuff. It's completely incongruous. But we've seen there's some hints of hope earlier in the part. And it doesn't make sense for Amos in warning Israel about the great threat they're under to put in a lot of salvation in there. That doesn't make sense. He needs to drive home the message that they're really in danger, and that's not supported by talking about a long-term future. But because God is a God who is always compassionate, there is hope in the end. And there's so therefore a bit of hope in Amos as well, even though I think we can be pretty sure it didn't feature very prominently in his preaching. And this is one of the things I consider, in particular in relation to Zephaniah as well, so we might get to that. How does that actually work in a prophet who has to announce a lot of judgment, those sing for joy, O Jerusalem? How would Zephaniah say it when? And you've got, of course, in bigger books like Isaiah, you've got this written at large. Whatever you think about who put the book of Isaiah together and who put us different prophets, clearly the second part, depart from here, depart from Babylon, is addressing people who are in exile in Babylon. Well, in the 8th century, they're not in exile in Babylon for another 200 years. How is that message being preached at this time? What significance does it have at that time? So that's an ongoing issue in the relationship between books and the oral message. We don't know whether Amos even included any of Amos 9 in his oral preaching. But we know that a faithful witness to God that has 9 chapters can barely not talk about salvation, because it would be a misrepresentation of God. It's possible to preach one sermon that is, really hard judgment, because sometimes you need to preach that judgment. So if you've got a very short book You can speak with integrity about God that really focuses on his punitive side. But if you've got a preaching ministry of 40 years, obviously there'll be a lot of salvation, a lot of talk about a resurrection as well as the cross. And so otherwise you're bearing false witness to God. And so in a similar way, I think if you end up with a book of 9 chapters credited to your name, it will be pretty hard not to have any sign of hope or judgment without bearing false witness to God. Because he's that kind of God who will bring hope out of disaster, life out of death. And as I've hinted at, Donald Gowan argues, and I'm inclined to believe that, the reason we have those prophetic books is to give that message about death and resurrection. There's got to be a bit of resurrection in there, even if there's not a great deal in Amos, and there's place therefore for a remnant, and it all comes together in the new Davidic kingdom. The quotations in the New Testament, if we were to look at that in detail, and if we had a week on Amos, I would obviously do that, but we don't. And so I won't look at them now because they're a bit complicated, because both those passages are using the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation, which is a bit different from the Hebrew text, and that difference is significant in some of the arguments. So there's a lot to discuss here. One intriguing thing is that Amos 5:25 to 27 and Amos 9:12 are the exact 2 passages that also feature in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran community. The 2 verses, they apply to their own situation in a specific way. It's a strange coincidence that those 2 passages picked from Amos are the same in the New Testament and in the Qumran community. But we do need to talk about the day of the Lord, because that is a very prominent thing in Amos and in the minor prophets. That first graphic on page 13, I need to keep my computer on in order to keep an eye on the time. So the first graphic is meant to give you a summary of what can happen with the day of the Lord. So it needs a brief explanation. Whenever you read about the day of the Lord, and sometimes the day of the Lord is referred to without that phrase, the day of the Lord, but it's clearly that kind of motive. There's a lot of debate where this comes from, which I ignore, but in the text here, what it refers to is a particular divine intervention. Like Amos saying, come prepare to meet your God. In a sense, you can meet God all the time going to the sanctuary. Or God is coming. In a sense, God doesn't need to come. He's there everywhere. But there's another sense in which God is particularly present and particularly met in certain events. So these are decisive events of God's intervention. And here are the options. The day of the Lord can be recounted, reported, as something that has already happened, or it can be anticipated as something that is going to happen, and as part of that can be interpreted. Can be interpreted positively. The day of the Lord can be a day of salvation, deliverance, and restoration, and it can be negative. It certainly is in Amos. The day of the Lord is annihilation, punishment, purification. And in fact, the day of the Lord can impact on God's people, and it's mostly talking about God's people in a way. But the day of the Lord language is also used for foreign nations. So it's a divine intervention that can happen in all sorts of ways. And one mistake that one can make, that unfortunately Eric Tully makes, is to think that the day of the Lord is always eschatological, the distant future. And it is not at all. The cross and resurrection of Christ, that is the day of the Lord, of course. Decisive divine intervention in history, supreme day of the Lord, maybe the greatest day of the Lord, unless we count Christ's coming and the final judgment as another great day of the Lord. But there are lots of anticipations of that, days of the Lord that happened before. So the day of the Lord is not one thing. It's not one day, let alone a 24-hour day. The day of the Lord is whatever time God comes to specifically intervene in setting things right. Now, in Amos, the day of the Lord is dark. Amos 5, 18 to 20. Who would like to read that for us? Yeah, so if we analyze that, thank you, rhetorically, we reading between a line, alas for you, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. That assumes that there are people who want the day of the Lord to come. So clearly, they would think of that as a jolly good thing. Oh, I wish the day of the Lord would come. Oh, I wish it was finally Christmas. Or wanting this good day to come, when God would intervene, and they assume that means, getting away with all the bad stuff and giving us lots of goodies. And Amos says, alas, why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light. So they assumed the day of the Lord would be light, because the light is a frequent image of the coming of God in the Bible, like the sunrise and so on. God comes, it'll all be light, it'll all be wonderful, all be salvation. And Amos says, no, God comes and it will all be dark. It'll be darkness. And it's usually interpreted as one of those shocking things that Amos does, an innovation that Amos does. Just like in Amos 1 and 2, he goes around setting his audience up for expecting God will judge all the other nations, and that means they will all be subdued and we will be blessed. No, it means we will be judged all the war. And so it brings that surprise on them. Only works the first time around. So I think it can be overplayed. And so people think, well, this is, people were thinking of the day of the Lord as a happy, sunny day, and Amos has this shocking message that it's darkness. But Don Collett has recently argued that he thinks actually that's not brand new. Josh was talking with me earlier, asking, what do you think about the darkness that descended upon Egypt before the Exodus? Was that the day of the Lord? Yeah, you could say, in a way. And what Don Collett focuses on, giving of the law at Sinai. Well, there's a lot of darkness there. There's a lot of cloud and a lot of threat there. And even if it had been an innovation by Amos, for those who read the book of the 12, it doesn't quite work like that. Because by the time we get to Amos, we've already read Hosea, which has a bit of the day of the Lord. And we already had Joel, which has day of the Lord all over the place. And I think this is the reason why Joel is in that prominent second position, even though it may be one of the latest, maybe the latest book, nearly of the book of the 12, but put there early, because the day of the Lord is so important in the book of the 12, and Joel is day of the Lord all over in different aspects of it. So having read Hosea and particularly Joel, no one would come to Amos with any naive ideas about this is going to be great fun. Let's have a day of the Lord to celebrate. No, they think, day of the Lord, that's the day of the Lord. I'm not desiring this, not outside anyway. So for us reading this, we would not be addressed as an audience that wants this to happen, because we know from Joel this is going to be, it's not going to be something you wish on your family or friends, let alone on yourself. And Don Collett argues he goes back all the way to the Exodus stories around Sinai, the original giving of the law, and he examines very closely, and in order to do that, you spend his whole PhD on it pretty much. Those linguistic and conceptual links between the Sinai appearance of God, theophany, Exodus 19 to 24, we've got the giving of the Ten Commandments. We have, at the end, then Moses and the elders feasting in the presence of God, and so on. So the appearance of God on Sinai, and then the golden calf incident, Exodus 32 to 34, that's also pretty significant throughout the Bible. And he argues that there are a lot of links between those two texts and days of the Lord texts all across the book of the 12. And he suggests, therefore, they are really borrowing that language from the Exodus. And so specifically for Amos, I've highlighted this in bold, the word for darkness in Amos, 5, 18, and 20, used twice. That's not used in Exodus 19 to 24, but another word that means thick darkness is used for the place where God is. God is light in some ways, yes, we read it often in the Bible, but he's darkness in other ways too. And surrounded by darkness is quite characteristic for God as well. And then Zephaniah later on and Joel make use of the same vocabulary of darkness and gloom, same combination that we find in Amos 5:10. And they also make use of imagery that links then more specifically with the Sinai theophany. So in Amos, the links are not as clear because he doesn't even use the same word for darkness. It's the same concept, but it's a bit harder to spot those links. Well, those other passages give us more links because they have the day of clouds and thick darkness, Zephaniah 1:15 and Joel 2:2, which picks up from Exodus 19, 20, and 24. And that day is heralded by quaking, which is there in Amos because we've got the earthquake, we've got the allusions there, but it's not as clearly linked with the day of the Lord. But it is clearly linked there in Joel 2. There's a sound of a fearsome trumpet in Zephaniah 1 when Zephaniah speaks about the day of the Lord, as well as in Joel 2. And just like Exodus 19, the appearance of God, there's a trumpet blowing. Then there is the devouring fire of God's wrath, which consumes, eats up, it's the word for eating here, all within its path. It's used in Zephaniah and Joel, and that's eating in Exodus 24. That's a looser link, I would say. And then a language of putting an end to your enemies, the word kala, putting an end, is there at Zephaniah 1, Nahum 1, and it's a key debate in Exodus 32 and 33. Because God is saying, I'll put an end to Israel. I had enough of it. Moses, step aside, I'll make an end. And Moses says, no, don't. I don't want you to start all over again with me. And so there's this big of a debate of putting an end to. So that word is used a lot there. And there is then judgment, slaughter executed upon apostate Israel in Exodus 32, which is foreshadowed with that reference to making an end to Israel because of their worship of the golden calf and rebellion. So when Amos talks about darkness and when he talks about an end, it may have been news to the people who desire the day of the Lord, but it's only news because they weren't sitting there meditating on Exodus. They were sitting there sipping their wine. And their wives were saying, oh, bring me some more. And they were there exploiting the poor. If they had been studying Exodus instead, they shouldn't be so surprised. Because this is what God does to his enemies, and they have become God's enemies. And it's what he did even to his own people, bringing that judgment with some of the same words used in Exodus that we find in other Days of the Lord passages in the book of Exodus, in the book of the 12. So there does seem to be more to that link. And the most important link to those different parts of Exodus is to Exodus 34, 6 and 7, which we should read, even if it's nearly the last thing we do. But it will set us up for tomorrow. And it's so important because it comes in the context of God proclaiming his name. You remember, I said I was going to come back to it. In the middle of that chasm, we had the name of God as a significance. What's the name of God? Yahweh. What does Yahweh mean? Well, here God explains what it means in two places. Early on, of course, when he reveals it to Moses, he reveals it in a rather mysterious way, I am who I am, or I will be who I am. It speaks to his consistency maybe, but it's spelled out more fully here. The Lord descended, verse 5, in the cloud. So it's the coming of God in the cloud, in darkness, stood with him there, with Moses, proclaimed the name, the Lord, Yahweh. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, so that's a divine name repeated twice, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children, to the 3rd and the 4th generation. These two verses are the part of the Old Testament that is most often quoted in the Old Testament itself. It's found in most often in other parts of the Old Testament. So it's very carefully phrased here. It's very carefully integrated into that whole storyline here to offer a commentary on God's behavior towards Israel. What's God's behavior towards Israel? They sin, and he doesn't destroy them, but he does punish them. So this two-sidedness of God is compassionate and forgiving, but he doesn't ignore sin. Those two things, they happen together in the story. And the Bible Project Character of God series has something on Exodus 34, and I thought that this was a nice graphic, so I've integrated it in the handout to show those cross-references to the link. Moses intercedes for Israel by asking, let's find grace. Let me find grace in your eyes. God is compassionate and gracious. God is patient with the Israelites grumbling throughout Exodus, which shows how slow to anger it is. I've only recently observed that during lockdown, how both Exodus and Numbers are wilderness stories, and in both Israelites complain all the time. But there's a major difference between the two. Because in Exodus, God always seems to, all right then, forgive them and ignore them. In Numbers, there's a lot more punishment in response to that rebellion. Because we've progressed in time. God is slow to anger, but he does eventually get angry when they violate the terms of the covenant. Or strictly speaking, as Nahum will emphasize, that God is always angry with evil. He doesn't flare up in anger. His anger against evil is consistent and constant all the time. But he doesn't act on it. So he's slow to anger in the sense that he's very slow to act on his anger. He's always opposed to evil, always hostile to evil, and therefore, in that sense, always angry with evil. Whenever there's evil, God is always angry about it, but he's slow to act on it. That's his compassion, abounding in loyal love and faithfulness. And so you see some more of the links spelled out in that table. I think it was called to summarize those key ideas that we get if we take together the appearance of God in Exodus 19 to 24 and the golden calf incident, we see that the revelation of God's word comes through Moses. God speaks through his prophet. Moses is the archetypal prophet, the prototype of all the prophets. Even though Abraham is called a prophet, that's just by the way. He's not really acting as a prophet in a typical sense. In fact, it's interesting that he's called a prophet when he's asked to intercede. Right? So we see the close link between intercession and prophecy. So he's a prophet in the sense of being really close to God, and therefore someone you should ask to intercede. But the prophet as someone who reveals God's word, for that Moses is really the prototype. Then there's a revelation of God's name in those passages, and there's God's judgment. So those three things go together: prophecy, revealing God's name, and judgment upon the people of God. And so we find specific echoes of Exodus 32, even in the language. So God says, I'm not going to exterminate Israel, but when the day comes for punishment, I will punish them for their sins. This is the NRSV. I wonder what ESV has on Exodus 32, verse 34. Can someone look that up? When the day comes for what? How does the ESV translate that? Exodus 32, verse 34. No, excellent. As I said here in the handout, visit is the other translation. That's partly to do with Hebrew. Hebrew vocabulary is smaller, much smaller than English vocabulary, certainly. And it was smaller in those days. But even then, the full range of vocabulary, I think, wasn't used for the Bible. So in the Bible, they reduced themselves further. The Bible vocabulary is comparatively small, given that we've got a huge range of literature spanning hundreds of years, very different genres. There's still plenty of vocab to learn if you learn Hebrew, but it could be a lot more. And it's because I think by God's inspiration, they deliberately restrict themselves to a narrow vocabulary. The word pakat here means punish. So, most likely. So punishment is a good translation if you're looking at that. The trouble is, if you translated punish as NRSV does, you miss the link to those other passages, the hyperlink to those other passages where it's translated visit. And so the ESV, instead of going for kind of greater clarity by translating punish, go for greater visibility of hyperlink by translating visit. And that very word visit, we've got in Hosea, the days of visitations have come. Literally, like on the day when I visit, it's the same in Hosea, the day of visitation. Amos 3, for on the day when I visit the transgressions of Israel upon him, I will visit the altars of Bethel. So we've got the double use of visit here. We've got the day of your watchment, even your visitation in Micah 7 and Zephaniah. And it shall happen on the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will visit upon the officials. Verse 9 as well, I will visit upon everyone. And the book of Hosea makes particularly frequent use of that word, pakat, for visit. Once we realize that in Exodus 32, that's the key word for punishment. I'm not going to punish you now, but when I do, it's a visitation. When we realize that that's a really key word that creates a link between the day of the Lord, which is a visitation, the day when your grandma comes visiting, oh no, more serious than that, the day when God comes visiting is the day of punishment. Because how visitation works out from Exodus 32 onwards is by way of punishment. So if you had been clever back in Israel in the 8th century, in the northern, you should have realized that the day of the Lord is not something that you should be so eagerly expecting, because it is going to bring punishment on God's people as it did in Exodus 32. Yeah, so I think Peter here does pick up the day of the Lord motive, and he uses it with reference to the day of the visitation, because visitation is such an important term, concept for the day of the Lord, that you can refer to the day of the Lord as a day of God's visitation, or even shortly, the day of visitation. Everyone knows it's God visiting. So there's another day of the Lord to come. We've had plenty of days of the Lord. The Exodus was the day of the Lord, arguably. Sinai was the day of the Lord, decisive intervention, revelation of God's name. The punishment of that generation that worshipped the golden calf is the day of the Lord. Amos announces the day of the Lord. That's the destruction of the northern kingdom. That's fulfilled, day of the Lord. But there are more and more days to come. Big day of the Lord, of course, cross and resurrection, as I've mentioned. Maybe Pentecost could be called as the day of the Lord. Unusual in there's not darkness there, no earthquake, but a strong wind and a decisive intervention by God. And certainly there's more to come. And Peter alludes to, we're not done with the day of the Lord yet. There's more fulfillment to come of that motive. And so I just end with today with that observation that when you read Amos 5:18 to 20, there are different ways of hearing those. You can imagine Amos speaking to an audience that had all happy ideas about Day of the Lord. And you think, oh, I'm really undermining this for you. And you just hear it in that context. Or you could think of it, well, we're not part of that audience. We now have it as part of the book. We have that book as part of the book of the 12. What function does it have in that big picture of Amos 5:1 to 17? How does the day of the Lord fit in there? And how does the day of the Lord fit in the day of the 12th when we read this after having read so much already about the day of the Lord in Joel? And it all may add different layers of meaning to what you make of the day of the Lord when you come with that understanding from Exodus and then Hosea and Joel. But that's probably enough for today. And we'll pick the story up by going to the beginning of the book of the 12, because we still haven't addressed that question. If Amos is the earliest of these prophets who've got a book after them, why is it Hosea that comes first in that collection of books? So we won't have time to go through Hosea in detail, but we look at the beginning of Hosea and briefly at the end of Hosea tomorrow before we move on to Jonah and Nahum.